Thank you, Senator Lyon-Helm. Senator Hume.
Deputy President, I rise today to speak on the Private Senator's Bill, Animal Export Legislation Amendment, Ending Long-Haul Sheep Exports Bill 2018. And of course, this particular piece of legislation has arisen from the very disturbing footage that we all saw, I think, on the Four Corners program back in April, when the footage of a number of sheep on the Emmanuel Exports ship were overcrowded, clearly overheated. It was profoundly upsetting, and I can understand exactly why this bill has come about in response to that. However, Acting Deputy President, live sheep exports, as we know, form a very large part of the Australian agricultural industry, and as you well know, the Morrison Coalition Government is a very strong supporter of industry in this country, unlike those who are trying to shut this down. The live export trade is certainly not a small industry. It is made up of farmers large and small across our great nation, and in fact, I'm sure you've all heard the phrase before that Australia is a country whose prosperity has ridden on the sheep's back. The live sheep trade in Australia has a very long and highly regulated history. In fact, it began in the 1930s, believe it or not, when Victoria and Tasmania began a domestic live sheep trade with fleets of 15 to 20 ships carrying loads of somewhere between 300 and 1,000 sheep back in the 1830s. By the late 1800s, Australia had begun exporting live sheep overseas. They were first exported from Western Australia in 1845, and by 1895, over 1,000 sheep were being sold for slaughter in Singapore. In 1926, interestingly, the Commonwealth introduced the Navigation, Deck and Cargo livestock regulations, the first time this industry was in fact regulated, to regulate the export of livestock. And these regulations dealt with such things as the provision of feed and water for that livestock, and also protection from the weather, in addition to drainage and also the construction and cleaning of pens and stalls. Now, interestingly, those regulations remained largely unchanged until the introduction of the Marine Orders Part 43 Cargo and Cargo Handling Livestock legislation in 1983, so it's quite a considerable period of time elapsed. In fact, the modern sheep export trade began in about 1945 to 46, when more than 24,000 sheep were sent from Western Australia to Singapore. The Middle East trade commenced in the early 1960s with the introduction of two small ships, each having the capacity of about 6,000 sheep. Prior to 1970, though, livestock were carried in quite small ships or as deck cargo. By the mid-1970s, ships capable of carrying around 50,000 sheep were coming into service, and these were mainly converted oil tankers, interestingly, that have been redeployed after the 1973 oil crisis. Larger ships were subsequently converted to carry up to 125,000 sheep at a time. Now, interestingly, when we started exporting live sheep to the 1970s, to the Middle East in the 1970s, the unions were in fact the ones that kicked up the most fuss. It was the AMIEU at that stage who felt that they were being retrenched as a result of the closure of abattoirs, and they blamed the expansion of the live sheep export trade for those closures. In 1982, in March and April, the Australian Sheep Meat Study Mission to the Middle East examined the demand for sheep meat in the Middle East, and the majority report concluded that there was in fact no close substitute for freshly slaughtered or hot meat among the indigenous Arab population. and the dissenting report of the AMIEU at that time, the members there concluded that the marketing initiatives by Australian exporters would expand the consumption of chilled and frozen mutton. Now, I thought this was quite interesting. In 1983, a severe cold snap, in fact, hit Victoria, and approximately 15,000 sheep died in the Portland feedlots as a result of cold and stress and exposure. And this was the event. This was, in fact, the event that focused the attention of animal welfare organisations and government authorities on the trade. So as you can see, animal welfare has been at the forefront of the Australian livestock export industry for many, many years. As you well know, Acting Deputy President, in more recent times, the coalition government has maintained a very consistent position on the regulation of this sector, ensuring best practice is adhered to. It is still such a very important industry to Australia. The Australian livestock export industry provides over 13,000 jobs, including 11,000 in rural and regional areas, to Australian workers, and in some parts of Australia it is the entire backbone of the community and of the economy. The supply of Australian livestock also ensures that hundreds of thousands of households across Asia and the Middle East have access to essential and affordable protein, as mentioned by Senator Rhiannon previously. These countries do not have the resources or the geography to efficiently produce livestock to feed their own people, and Australia is very much at the forefront of the demand of livestock exports. The federal government released some time ago its Asian Century White Paper, which showed exactly that Australia had a very important role to play in providing food to Asia's growing population, and livestock exports are a fundamental part of that food solution. Earlier this year, as you well know, Acting Deputy President, the Coalition Government commissioned veterinarian Dr. Michael McCarthy to conduct a review into the live export trade in response to that shocking Four Corners program. You will remember that Minister for Agriculture David Littleproud said at the time that there will be no knee-jerk reaction over the deaths of thousands of sheep in a live export consignment. He said that despite the industry concern that the trade could be damaged or shut down, while he was, and I think this is a quote, his particular quote was, he was shocked and gutted by the footage. He did warn that those doing the wrong thing were going to, and again, I'm quoting him directly, get nailed, but the response should not be knee-jerk. That response prompted a little bit of concern from the industry that there would be damage to the trade, but Mr Littleproud said he supported farmers and exporters who did the right thing. He also said, however, that he would not be afraid to call out and take strong action against those who have not fulfilled their responsibilities. He suggested that we need to create an environment where groups, where whistleblowers and where individuals are comfortable and confident to come forward so that those who are doing the wrong thing can be identified and dealt with appropriately. The WA Pastorists and Graziers Association President Tony Seabrook said that despite the distressing nature of the incidents that were reflected on the Four Corners program, they did not reflect the standards of the wider live export industry. He said also that the release of the footage was motivated not by those who were responsible, but by activists who were in fact intent on shutting the industry down for whatever motives they may have. Mr. Seabrook said that there are a group of people totally committed to shutting down the industry, and they don't give a, and this is, I'm quoting him again here, they don't give a damn about the impact it might have throughout the whole length and depth of Northern Australia. He also said that there was no one in rural Australia that deals with sheep and cattle that wants to see that sort of thing happen. But what does need to be recognised is that we stand like a beacon in the darkness when it comes down to animal welfare standard, especially live export. And that does seem to be the response of the McCarthy review. So Dr McCarthy's task was to review the health and welfare of sheep being transported to the Middle East during the Northern Hemisphere summer. There were 23 recommendations, and the coalition government, as has already been said here this morning, accepted all 23 of those recommendations, with further review into one of those. The Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, as the independent regulator, began implementing those recommendations immediately. The changes to the regulation of the trade included a reduction in the stocking densities so that less sheep will be carried on a vessel at any given time. I think that that was probably one of the most shocking things about the footage, is the overcrowding, which you could only imagine must intensify the already oppressive heat on those ships. So reducing the stocking densities means that sheep will get up to 39% more space. Stocking densities are being reduced by up to 28%. That was one of the first of Dr McCarthy's recommendations. The reportable mortality level will also be halved from 2 to 1%, which means that more than 1%, if more than 1% of sheep die, they must be reported and investigated, which is a significant change. All vessels carrying sheep to the Middle East during the Northern Hemisphere summer will be equipped with automated watering systems. I have to admit that I thought this was a shocking one. The fact that those automated watering systems didn't already exist took me by surprise. However, that will no longer be the case. In addition, independent observers, and this is particularly important, are being placed on every livestock export voyage by sea from Australia, not just the sheep voyages during the northern summer, and that those independent observers will be reporting directly to the independent regulator. So these, Acting Deputy President, are very strong steps to ensure that this industry can continue into the future. And it is truly important that it does, because the live export industry, as you know, may have considerable ramifications should it slow down. It is still a major source of income to farmers, particularly in WA. The demand for live sheep in the Middle East is as high as ever. For cultural and historical and economic reasons, the majority of countries in the Middle East have demand of over 50% that their sheep for sheep processing and slaughtered come locally to them. And it's an opportunity, it highlights the opportunity and the important nature that this industry has for Australia. It really is important to note, as mentioned earlier by Senator Smith, that the live export industry in Australia produces very, very high welfare outcomes and continues to improve, reducing mortality rates on average from 0.89% in 2010 to 0.71% in 2017. In fact, the entire industry is, one could say, is being unfairly judged on actions that are not representative of the industry as a whole. It is more the virtue of a few bad players. If concern genuinely is the welfare of the sheep, then surely there would be a demand for Australia to remain in this industry and to lead by example as the most responsible international participant, as the country who has such a good record of animal welfare, not just in sheep exports but also in other forms of livestock. There should be, theoretically, more calls for Australia to stay in the market and to lead this sector. So, in conclusion, Acting Deputy President, the acceptance of all 23 McCarthy recommendations is potentially the best example of that leadership, and while this bill should be admired for its intentions, its outcomes would be catastrophic not just on the WA live sheep industry, but on Australia's economy as a whole.
Thank you, Senator.